So welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming. We have a full house today, which is great. And there's still people coming in, but we're going to get it started because we have a lot of ground to cover. There's seats up front for those who are still looking. And we'll just get going here so we can get to everything. I have a couple quick announcements before we introduce our presenter and our panelists. First, my name is David Alcocer. I am the Government Affairs Director of the PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California, and I'm sure most or all of you are very familiar with PPIC, but we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank based in San Francisco with offices here in Sacramento, and we do a lot of research on most of the issues that cross the plate here in Sacramento. A couple of quick thank yous too. This event is part of the James Irvine Briefing Series, which is funded by the James Irvine Foundation, and so we wanted to thank them for that. Also, this particular study we're going to talk about today was funded by the Donald Bren Foundation, so we wanted to say thank you to them. I will make what we're going to talk about today, college affordability. We're going to have a presentation from one of our researchers, Hans Johnson, who I will introduce in just a minute. And then we will have a panel discussion with some experts who are really going to help us look further into this topic. And then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience at the end. And this is being live webcast, so if you want to silence your cell phones and avoid an embarrassing moment, this would be a good time to do that. Also, on your chair, you should have a copy of the report that we're going to talk about today, and also the slides that you'll see in a couple minutes will be on the website, ppic.org. Also, the video from today's event will also be there. And there's an evaluation form on your chair as well. If you wanted to fill it out at the end of the event and drop it off on the table as you leave and tell us how you think we did, that would be very much appreciated. Also, a couple quick announcements about events we have upcoming. In 2 days, on Thursday, we are hosting an event with Senate President Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg at the Sheraton Hotel here in Sacramento. There'll be a luncheon Q&A with Mark Baldessari, the president of PPIC, and the Senate President, which will cover a lot of ground. There's a lot obviously going on in Sacramento, so I think that conversation is going to cover a lot of topics. We talked with a similar event recently with the Assembly Speaker. On next Tuesday, June 11th, this will be in San Francisco at our conference center there in the Finance District. We're hosting an event about political reform and campaign finance issues with Ann Ravel, the Executive Director of the Fair Political Practices Commission, and Alan Zarenberg, the President of the California Chamber of Commerce. And that's a discussion that will be moderated by Scott Schaefer from KQED. That will also be webcast, so you can, if you don't get to San Francisco that day, you can watch that online. And then on June 21st, this is a big event, also in San Francisco, also webcast if you can't get there. But we'll be hosting an event with Arne Duncan, the Secretary of Education in the U.S. Department of Education. And there'll be a conversation with, again, Mark Baldessari, the President of PPIC, at the Conference Center at PPIC. So with that, I will introduce our speaker today, who will give us a presentation about the report, and then we'll get to the panel. Hans Johnson is the co-director of research at PPIC. He is a Bren Fellow at PPIC, and he's a demographer who has done a lot of work in the last couple of years about higher education issues. So please welcome Hans Johnson.
Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the panelists for coming. And I'd like to note my co-authors, who all were able to make it here today. So they're Marisol Cuellar Mejia, David Ezekiel, and Betsy Zeiger. All of us are with PPIC, except Betsy, who actually had been a summer intern at PPIC and now is a graduate student at UC Davis. So skyrocketing tuition and fees, increasing student debt, and a weak economy have led many to wonder whether the benefits of going to college are worth the costs. More students than ever are taking on student loans, a troubling trend that suggests access to college is becoming more difficult for more students in California. And this is occurring as our economy is increasingly demanding more highly educated workers. In this report and in this presentation, we and I in the presentation are going to quickly review the status of student debt in California, and we're going to consider that debt in light of economic benefits of attending college. Let me make sure I could get this to work. So the big context here is that student debt is increasing. The state has made sharp cuts to higher education funding as a result of a reduction in revenues that have occurred during the recession. Of course, we're on a slightly different path right now with the current governor's budget providing some increase in funding. But colleges, in the face of these budget cuts from the state, have increased tuition pretty dramatically. And as a result, we see more and more students finding paying for college more difficult. At the same time, as I noted, from a macroeconomic perspective, California needs more college graduates. Our long-term projections suggest that the state needs about 1 million more college graduates with a bachelor's degree. Other people have suggested the gap is more than 2 million when we look at people with associate's degrees or certificate degrees as well. So that's a bit of context. Given that context, at PPIC, what we did was we said, well, what are the big issues with respect to student debt, and how might we answer them? So the first thing we did was we outlined what has been happening actually in California with respect to student debt. I'll go over that first. And then we asked the question, well, does it make economic sense to go into debt? So that's really a question about labor market returns to going to college. And then finally, well, how should public policy address student debt issues? And I'll get to that last. So first, what's happening with student debt? Well, the first measure we looked at were the share of students who are taking out loans. Now, there's a lot of different data sets that we've used in this project and in this report. They're available in the report itself, and then in our technical appendices, which are available online, we have the full details of the data and the methods that we chose. We focused on undergraduate education, and in these first set of slides, we're focusing on first-time freshmen. And so this chart shows you the percent of first-time freshmen in California from 2000 through 2010-11 that took out loans. And you'll see that there's a bit of good news here. That is that the share of students taking out loans is lower in California than it is in the rest of the United States, California being the gold line here. But then there's a bit of bad news as well. The share of students taking out loans has increased pretty dramatically in California, from only about a third of all freshmen in 2007 to almost half, 45% of first-time freshmen by 2010. And this increase is more dramatic in California than it has been in the rest of the United States. Now, one of the primary determinants of whether or not a student takes out a loan is the type of institution that that student attends. And we, as others, have found that students who attend private colleges are much more likely to take out loans than students who attend public colleges. This difference between public and private colleges is actually more stark in California than it is in the rest of the United States. And in particular, students who attend private for-profit colleges are extremely likely to take out loans. Almost 80%, again, of first-time freshmen at those institutions take out loans, compared to only about 39% of students at UC and CSU, and only 4% of students at California's community colleges. California's public institutions do a pretty good job of keeping students out of debt. So when we compare public four-year colleges in California with public four-year colleges in the rest of the United States, loan rates are lower in California than they are elsewhere. That's driven primarily by a relatively low loan shares at the California State University system. And then finally, also our community colleges have very low shares of students taking out loans, only about 4%, compared to nationally it's about 22%. Because the public sector is so large in California as well, we have a larger share of our students in the public sector than in the private sector, more so than the rest of the United States. This also leads to the patterns that I just showed you, where California has a lower share of students taking out debt than taking out loans than in the rest of the United States. But again, here's the bad news. The bad news is that we see pretty sharp increases, again, in students taking out loans. And I say bad, I mean, we'll get to this discussion in a little bit. It's not necessarily bad if it means you're actually completing college and you're able to afford college, and you'll see where I go with that at the end of this talk. But in any event, you see that for the public colleges, the increase has been the most dramatic in terms of the share of students that are taking out loans. Okay, so what about the amount of those loans? Again, here we're focusing on first-time freshmen, and these numbers are adjusted for inflation. California, again, is in gold. And you'll see that the size of the loans has increased pretty dramatically over the last few years by about $1,500 in California. This pattern towards increasing loans is clearly attributable to the increasing costs of going to college. And again, we see, well, what are the primary determinants on the size of the loans that students take out? And again, the primary determinant is really whether or not you go to a private college or a public college. And then within that, we see a pretty sharp difference between those freshmen who are attending private for-profit colleges compared to students who are attending private nonprofit colleges. And then you'll see, as shown here, the students who go to UC and CSU, and here I'm just restricting this to the share of students with loans, so realize it's a lower share at UC and CSU than it is elsewhere. But for those freshmen with loans at UC and CSU, their loan amounts are only about half of what we see at the private for-profits. But once again, when we look at the size of the increases over the last few years, we see those increases occurring across all the institution types here, but especially notable for UC and CSU, with average loan amounts for freshmen increasing by about 33% over just this relatively short time period from 2007 to 2010. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about accumulated debt. So we used another set of data to look at students who first entered college in 2003 and then followed them through to 2009. 6 years later. Some of them dropped out, some of them graduated and then went to work, some of them were still in college. And we looked at the accumulated amount of debt of those students 6 years after entering. And then what I'm showing you here is the distribution of that student debt. So before, what I was showing you were the averages, and those are useful and meaningful. But when we think about students who might be at risk, I think we're especially concerned with students who take on excessive amounts of debt. And you can define excessive amounts of debt in different ways. Here I've highlighted in red students and the institutions they attend where the amount of debt exceeds or is about $40,000 or greater, which seems to me subjectively to be maybe excessive. And so when you look at this, there's a couple things to notice. I'm showing you these percentiles, so let's focus, for example, on the 90th percentile, which is on the far right here, and look at California public four-year colleges. So the 90th percentile, meaning that 90% of students have lower amounts of debt, accumulated debt, and 10%, only 10% have higher amounts of accumulated debt. In California is $26,000. That's lower than my subjective excessive debt level. Where we see students taking on this excessive debt in California is the private nonprofits. 25% of those students have at least $41,900 in debt. And then when we compare California with the rest of the United States, you see that at public four-year colleges in the rest of the United States, $39,800 is the 90th percentile, which is about my level of excessive debt. So that means 10% of public college students in the rest of the United States are taking on excessive debt, whereas again in California it's actually a substantially lower figure. So that's partly good news. One thing that's interesting to note here is that the private for-profits actually end up looking maybe a little better than the private nonprofits. And if you look at the median level, the 50th percentile, they look even better than the publics. And the reason for that is they don't finish. They're not in college very long. So along with the type of institution that you attend that determines the amount and whether you take out a loan, well, how long you're in college matters a lot. And so even though the loan amounts, cumulative loan amounts are not that high, or well, I'd say they're high, but they're not as high as some of these other types of institutions, it's not for good reasons. It's because students aren't finishing. And we have in our paper regression frameworks where we control for that, and all kinds of interesting data that show you that private for-profits really do stand out in terms of student debt amounts and in terms of students taking out loans. So then finally, maybe the best measure of students at risk are students who are now trying to pay back their loans and who can do it and who can't. And again, the glass is half full, the glass is half empty. California looks better than the rest of the nation. In California, about 7.4% of people with student loans are in default, compared to about 9.1% in the rest of the United States. And you see some other states here. New York looks pretty good. Texas, not so great, and Arizona looks really bad. I suspect that part of what's happening with Arizona is that a lot of University of Phoenix students are identified as being in Arizona, and the private for-profits, again, tend to have pretty high loan default rates. Okay, so we've identified that some students take out a lot of debt. We've identified that California patterns are better than the nation, but they're going up. So then there's this question, well, what's happening in the labor market, and is college still a good investment? So there are a number of things that we could look at with respect to the labor market. Certainly, one of the most primary measures is unemployment. And here I'm showing you unemployment rates in 2007 and 2012 for different levels of educational attainment for people in the labor force. And you see that while it is true that unemployment rates have gone up quite a bit for people with a bachelor's degree or graduate degree, on a percentage point basis, they've gone up even more for people who have only a high school diploma or who have not completed high school. And certainly, when we look at this pattern in 2012, it's quite clear that going to college and graduating from college is a better place to be in the labor market than people with less education. But what about wages? Well, wages is actually even more dramatically different than unemployment in some ways. So when we look at what we call wage premiums, which is the difference in wages for someone who has earned a bachelor's degree compared to a high school diploma, controlling for other personal characteristics, we see that that wage premium for men and women in California is about the same across the genders, but that it has grown over time. So from 1990, let's take women, for example, they earned about 39% more than men on average in California. I mean, sorry. That would be big news. Yeah, so I'm not saying anything more about that. That's another study for another day. 39% more than a high school graduate, similar in terms of other characteristics for women in California. And then going to 2000, that wage premium had grown to 50%, and by 2011, it's still growing up to about 57%. So this demand for college-educated labor as expressed through wages is quite clear, and that pattern has persisted. Very important message. A lot of newspapers don't seem to cover that part of this story. But then there's this other question, well, will I be able to pay back my loans? What if I major in the humanities? Will I be able to pay back my loans? This is a question I get asked all the time. So we looked at data that showed wages by major, and we're showing you the percentile distributions again here to look at what the range of outcomes is for adults in the labor force in California. And I'm showing you the different majors, and then at the bottom are people who have only graduated from high school for comparison's sake. And you'll see that, and then these lines here go out to the 10th percentile is the far left part of each one, and then the start of the blue bar on the left part is the 25th percentile. The median is the line where we switch from blue to brown, and then the 75th percentile is the right-hand side of the brown distribution. And then finally, the 90th percentiles is the end of the what are called whiskers. These are box and whisker plots on the far right-hand side. And so, there's not necessarily a shock here, I don't think. I mean, engineering and computer science in California, those majors, those graduates do very well in our labor market, earning around $80,000 or more dollars per year from this median level. But even for students in the humanities, for example, you'll see that they tend to do much better than high school graduates. And even if you take the 75th percentile of high school graduates, there is no major where the 25th percentile of the wage earners for that major are below the 75th percentile for the high school graduates. So putting it in more simple terms, high wage earners for high school graduates compared to other high school graduates don't do as well as low wage earners for students who graduate from college, regardless of your major. Okay, and then finally we calculated, as others have done, a net lifetime payoff of attending college. So this, what I'm showing you here, this is actually in millions of dollars, and this is the difference in wages over the lifetime, projected over the lifetime, for a college graduate compared to a high school graduate by major. And we're taking into account the costs of going to college, including the lost wages that occurred while you were in college. So this is trying to net out the cost of going to college from those economic gains. And you see that over the lifetime, these gains are huge. For engineering graduates, around almost 1.2 million, but even at the low end for education majors, around $240,000. And that probably says something too about public policy. But in any event, for every group, the returns are positive. And even when we play around with these numbers and say, well, what if we increase tuition to private college level tuitions in this? Is the payoff positive? And the answer is yes. What if we discount wages by about 10%? So there's this debate about the wage premiums I showed you. Is that because people who go to college are just more, have higher skills in general and would have done just as well had they not gone to college if they'd just gone from high school and straight into the workforce? The best estimate suggests that about 10% of the college wage premium might be attributable to what we call these selection effects with more highly skilled people going to college. So even if we take off 10% off your wages, we still find that the net benefit is positive for every major. And for most majors, it's very highly positive. All right? So at the end of the day, when we say, is college worth it? I think for most students, we have the answer is a resounding yes. It clearly is worth it. But there are students at risk and students that we should be concerned about. Those who are taking on excessive debt, those who don't complete college, and then finally those who enroll in private for-profit colleges. And certainly there's a range of private for-profit colleges, some having better outcomes than others. All right, so how should public policy address some of these issues? Well, first, I think in terms of context, Californians are very concerned about our higher education system. They're very concerned about affordability. In this question that we asked in our statewide survey, 3/4 of Californians agreed with the statement that students have to borrow too much money to pay for their college education. So they're clearly very concerned about the amount of student loans and student debt that Californians are taking out. California has a long history, and in fact, the master plan enshrines this ideal of making higher education affordable for as many Californians as possible. And so in the past, we did that by making tuition levels very low, even at our four-year colleges and universities. Today, it's really only the community colleges where tuitions are relatively low. They've come up so that at CSU, they're maybe middle of the pack, and at UC, near the top of public colleges. So one strategy the state could and should consider, and is considering, is to provide additional funding. The governor has talked about this in his budget, to keep tuition at public colleges affordable. In fact, the governor has gone to the Board of Trustees of CSU and the Regents meetings at UC to encourage them to keep tuition from increasing, and that's the path we're on right now with the increased funding. So I think that's good news. The other item that we've talked about here quite a bit is the community colleges, and that the students take out loans pretty infrequently there. The cost of those those institutions is much lower. And this pathway from community colleges to four-year colleges and universities is perhaps the most efficient pathway from a dollars perspective for a student to earn a bachelor's degree in California, in fact, probably in the United States. And so that pathway is one that we really want to make sure is working well. There are a lot of efforts to improve that pathway. The Student Success Task Force that looked at ways to improve that pathway has led to some legislation. I think that's all good. We have, for example, an associate's degree for transfer, which is the first time we have this degree that means you will be able to transfer, and you know going in what you need to take to get to be able to transfer. That's between CSU and the community colleges. So that's a step in the right direction, but it's not comprehensive, certainly not yet. And then I think the state has done a good job and should pat itself on the back for the most part in ensuring that grants in our state, they're called Cal Grants, are available for lower income students, and that those Cal Grants have risen so that they do pay for the increased tuition and fees at UC and CSU. So those are steps in the right direction. We want to encourage the grant programs to remain or to become even stronger and more robust in our state. But then finally, we know that students will still need to take out loans. And there is this question then, well, is it a good idea to take out loans? And for many students, it is. If you are able to complete college because you took out a loan, that's a good thing, and you should take out a loan. Obviously, we don't want students to take out loans who can't repay them, students who are going to institutions where it's not likely that they'll be able to succeed. And so California needs to make sure that we have policies that encourage the use of the right kinds of loans at the right point in time. And I'm sure the panel will talk more about some of those issues. And then finally, for a lot of Californians who are middle or higher income and not eligible for grants, there is a concern about how they're going to pay for college. And I think one interesting example for the state to consider would be prepaid tuition programs. And in fact, many states have these programs. In Florida, hundreds of thousands of families have signed up for their state's program. And that program assures that if parents save a certain amount of money, by the time their student graduates from high school, they are guaranteed that that savings account will pay for college tuition. Now, there are lots of issues with respect to that, accounting issues and other kinds of issues. But I think that is an idea that's worth considering in California that would help more and more parents and students be able to afford college. And it is finally in all of our interests to see that college going and college completion increase in our state. Completing college is a private good, yes, it increases your wages, but it's a public good too. It increases tax revenue for everybody, decreases reliance on social services, and leads to a lot of other externalities, a lot of other positive effects that we should value as a state. And so it is right for the public to be engaged and invested in higher education. So now I'd like to invite the panel up for the question and answer time with Dave Lesher. And I'm going to join the panel as well.
Well, thank you very much, Hans. The panelists take our seats. We'll get transition here to the panel discussion. I posted this event on Facebook this morning, and I said it's being webcast, so now my mother is watching. I want to say hi, Mom. And there's actually a good audience out there, I believe. So I will introduce the panelists, and then we'll have a couple of questions from me, the moderator, to moderate a discussion. Hans is going to contribute as he sees an opportunity, or else I'll ask him a tough question if there's nothing else. And then we'll open it up to questions, and we'll have a microphone that goes around so that the people out in TV land can hear the question. So to introduce the panel, on the left side, or your right side of the dais, is David Alcocer. He's the Interim Director of Student Financial Support at the University of California Office of the President. His team is responsible for developing policies and programs related to undergraduate and graduate financial aid for the UC system. And next to him is Debbie Cochrane. She's the Research Director with the Project on Student Debt at the Institute for College Access and Success. She does work at the state and national level and is an expert on financial issues in California. And then Hans Johnson, as I mentioned, is our co-director of research. So just to segue from Hans's presentation about the report, I wanted to open up with a question before we get to talking about solutions or reforms here of kind of defining the problem. There were a couple of important messages in the report that student debt is going up, but also that college is still worth it, and that California is doing something as well. And so I'll start with you, David. What are you concerned about? What are your red flags? How do you look at this issue?
Sure. Thank you, David. Thank you to PPIC for hosting this event and for putting together such an excellent report. I think it does a fantastic job of putting some hard data and analysis behind what is clearly a concern and a growing one, not just in California, but nationwide, about college access. We at UC, and I personally very much are concerned about student debt and its impact on students' aspirations and whether they can, in fact, attend college. We have done quite a bit of work among our colleagues at the UC campuses and working with our own staff and others at the State House to do what we can to mitigate the impact at UC. California, I think one reason for the relatively better results for California is that we have a combination of both a very strong state grant program, the Cal Grant program, and fairly robust institutional aid programs at UC and CSU. But nevertheless, there are clearly more and more students who are graduating with higher levels of debt and do not have the kinds of earnings potential because they did not actually, I think, get what they thought they were paying for at some of the segments and some of the institutions. There are definitely some actors that are better than others in terms of the value that they provide, and I think this report has gone a long way to illustrate that. In terms of sort of opportunities for intervention or for modifications, I think we should think about it frankly, at every stage of a student's career, both from what can be done in K-12 to increase awareness of the payoff of a college degree, how to make students and families better consumers or shoppers, so to speak. What can we do while the student is enrolled in terms of sustaining strong grant programs? And then what kind of counseling can we provide after students graduate so that they can avoid default, can remain in good standing, and actually have a chance of paying off the debt that they have incurred. So, and I hope we can think about sort of all of those stages in terms of a solution.
Good, thank you. And Debbie, how big of a concern is this, do you think, the student debt increase?
You know, I think actually Hans and his team did a really good job in the report laying out what the data show and where there are areas of concern and where there actually are not areas of concern. I think, you know, we also do at the Institute for College Access and Success in our project on student debt, we do an annual report on student debt for bachelor's degree graduates at states, all the states in the country, and generally find, as Hans did, that California ranks pretty well. The debt is generally lower here for some of the reasons that David mentioned. But I think those are really the best case scenarios. You know, when you see the number, I think our number says something like $26,000 for bachelor's degree graduates, which is a slightly different way of looking at it from this report. You know, in some ways that kind of sounds an alarm. $26,000, that's a lot of debt. On the other hand, well, you know, the general kind of rule of thumb, to the extent there is one, is that debt be less than your first year earnings. So, okay, $26,000, maybe that seems pretty reasonable. A lot of students graduate without any debt. And they have a bachelor's degree, and we know that there are real premiums to the bachelor's degree. I think where you start to see or have serious concerns is when you do look at these trend lines and you realize why students are borrowing. Students borrow when there's not enough money out of their own pockets or out of their savings or earnings, in that either from the students or their families, to pay for college costs, or when there's not enough grant aid available to help cover the remaining balance. And we know that there are problems in all of those areas. I mean, there's real state disinvestment in our public institutions, and that's an issue in California, where so many of the college students do go to public institutions. You know, we do see these, you know, relative stagnation in income compared to where we were and the growth that we saw in you know, not so distant times. And stagnating grant aid. We do have this Cal Grant program, which is an incredibly strong state grant aid program, and it has a very strong piece of it for UC and CSU students in particular, where the program naturally does grow to keep up with students' costs. But all the other students don't experience that type of growth on the natural, and so there has been real decline in the purchasing power of Cal Grants too. So I think all of those are real causes for concern.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. Hans, anything to add? Or?
Nope.
Okay. I wanted to talk about one of the issues that Hans raised, the pathway from community colleges, and to explore that. Perhaps the cheapest way to get a 4-year degree is to go through community colleges, and as Hans talked about, we've established this degree for transfer at the community college system, but there's more work to be done to make this an effective route for those who find it the most affordable. David, let me start with you. UC has not yet integrated or adopted the transfer degree yet, correct? And how do you see the pathway from community college to UC, and especially in context of affordability?
Sure. I'll address the first part of the question first. So the associate degree for transfer is essentially a commitment that students who take certain courses while at a community college, those will transfer and satisfy all of these sort of lower division requirements of certain degrees at every CSU campus. And so the only remaining courses that they essentially need to take for that are the upper division courses in that degree. UC has seen that as actually an excellent start to a conversation around how to look for ways to improve transfer. We have not adopted it wholeheartedly in the sense of that same commitment, because there is actually a great degree of diversity in the requirements and the nature of degrees amongst our UC campuses, even within the same discipline. For example, psychology is a great example. I think at 6 of our 9 campuses, the psychology program there is very much an experimental or biological psychology program, whereas at the other 3, it's more of a clinical social psychology emphasis. Those have very different prerequisites, and so the work that we would expect students to do in their first 2 years to succeed are quite different. So we're not in a position, and we don't think it's necessarily setting a student up to succeed, to say that they'll be able to succeed in these upper division courses and these different kinds of programs if they take a certain set as undergrads. Having said that, we are making more accessible what are clear articulation agreements between UC campuses and individual community colleges, so that a student at a particular college can pick a campus and a major, and for the top 20 majors, see what are the actual courses at their community college that satisfy what lower division requirements at that UC campus. Because we do think that transfer is an important path, not just for students from an affordability perspective, but students who, for whatever point or whatever reason in their lives, might make it not feasible for them to immediately leap to a 4-year residential commitment, which is kind of the standard UC model. And so far, we have been, I think that the outcomes for the transfers who do come to UC have been quite strong. Their average graduation rate once they arrive is 2.4 years. So if you assume that they've used 2 years at a community college, that puts them pretty close to the average time to degree for native freshmen. The second part of the, well, affordability generally, and that's actually for transfers as well, a great example of where the transfer entitlement program for Cal Grants has been a huge boon to those students. Many of them happen to be independent. They have fewer financial resources than the typical undergraduate, and so it's been valuable for them. The key is, of course, for them to make very good use of the 2 years while they're at the community college, to get there before they exhaust too much of their Cal Grant, to make sure they're making wise choices about where they eventually what they're taking and how that satisfies requirements where they go to.
Thank you. So Debbie, could you talk about the community college pathway and how that's helpful in terms of affordability for higher education here?
You know, I will start off by saying I think obviously it's a critical pathway in terms of access to higher education. That's where about 2/3 of the state's undergraduate students enroll. And so there's no denying that that segment provides so much access to higher education that would not exist without it. You know, from an affordability angle, I think it's a little less clear. You know, we know obviously that tuition and fees are very low, and so students tend to not borrow as much when they're at the community colleges. But I think that leads to a kind of an underappreciation of all the other types of costs that students do have to incur while they're students. You know, transportation costs, room and board, food, all those types of costs that people just have to pay when they're a student. And so, you know, what you see is not just that they don't borrow, it's that often that they make life choices about how to go. You know, they're going to go part-time instead of full-time to be able to afford it without borrowing. And the end result isn't that they transfer without any debt. The end result is often that they just don't get to transfer at all. So I think, you know, I think, you know, David mentioned the kind of average graduation rate for transfer students, and sometimes I feel like the, you know, some of the students who have managed to get through the community college process, they've figured out how to navigate the entire bureaucracy, all the services they need, their courses, they've gotten all the classes they need to articulate. They can probably, like, I don't know, build a rocket ship and fly to the moon. Of course they're going to graduate, right? Of course. So the problem is really not just an affordability angle. It's like, how do we get the people there? There's actually also been some other research that shows that students who do transfer to four-year institutions from community colleges, and this is national research, often graduate with about the same amount of debt. So maybe they went to the community college thinking they could go and avoid debt, but in the end, they come out about as likely to have debt and with about the same amount of debt. And so sometimes that's because of the lack of availability of grant aid at the institutional level for the transfer students.
You know, if I could just follow, I think Debbie raises a really great point. In some ways, I think it's helpful to look at inordinate debt or unmanageable debt as almost more of a symptom as in something dysfunctional has happened to sort of led to that outcome, right? And how to address that might vary depending on the kind of student you're talking about. For example, in some instances, it's that the student made an unwise decision to begin with in terms of the school that they chose, the likelihood that they thought they would graduate from it, and what they were going to pay out of pocket. And I think, frankly, some of the statistics that PPIC has shown for some of the schools in the for-profit segment would suggest that that's a pretty fair way to characterize some of those students. In other instances, if we're looking about sort of college access, I think it's a great question where if the goal is to support and expedite transfer as a lower cost alternative, is what's needed there additional financial aid, which is kind of, what we'd think sort of an intuitively obvious way to address concerns of debt? Or are the levels of debt there actually manageable, and what's really needed is more support for the infrastructure of that system as a whole, to be able to accommodate those students, to provide the advice and guidance to them, and to actually help them succeed and go on to UC, or to UCSU, or to wherever they transfer to. And for students who are actually at a school like a UC or a CSU that has had to raise fees pretty substantially recently because of cutbacks in state funding, that's clearly the cause, the kind of root cause. And so presumably the solution there is really looking at where does public higher education rank on the list of priorities for our legislators and for the governor? And how do we make sure that what we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years is not repeated going forward and become sort of accepted as the norm?
I would also just say, echo that completely, that we do need more help for the infrastructure, including financial aid administration. One of the points that was brought up before was we want to make sure that people aren't using up their Cal Grant while they're at a community college. The idea is you get 4 years, you use 2 of them at a community college, 2 of them once you transfer. And who tells students who have gotten 2 years of a community college Cal Grant that they've used up half their grant? Nobody. Nobody, not at the community college and not at the Student Aid Commission. At least they hadn't as of the last time I asked. We need more help with the counseling. If we want students to be able to make wise decisions about where to go, how to finance it, we have to, provide the services that they need to get the counseling that will help them make those decisions. We also just frankly need better data about, that will help inform their decisions. The cumulative debt data that we have from colleges is just really poor. Both PPIC and TCAS do the best we can with it, but it's not good enough. And it's not enough for students to really understand what their likelihood of graduating is with how much debt and what their income is going to be.
Yeah, I would really reiterate that. Often at PPIC, one of our primary recommendations is we need better data so that we can have better policies. And, I would have had that on here, but I've said that like 5 times in the last 5 months here in Sacramento. So. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I think the other part of this report that we weren't really able to get into very much was that it's not all loans are equal. And I know that both David and Debbie have ideas on that too. But certainly one recommendation is to make sure, and this goes along the veins of providing good information to students, is letting them know what they're eligible for in terms of grants, but also in terms of loans and the differences in the loans. And it'd be great if you guys could talk about some of those differences.
Sure. So, there's obviously a lot of discussion and debate right now about what the appropriate interest rate is for particularly subsidized Stafford loans, unsub as well. But setting that aside, clearly students are better off with the loans available under the federal Stafford and Perkins programs. They offer much more flexible repayment plans, including a new income-based repayment plan that is geared specifically for those students who, in a time of recession, don't have the kind of earnings coming out of the gate that allows them to manage and repay the debt that they have. We're concerned about for some students who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances, we're concerned whether there's actually enough loan volume available from those programs for them. The standard limits for subsidized loans for an undergraduate freshman is $3,500. That works in many cases, but in many cases it doesn't, particularly if the student has a family that's not coming through on its so-called parent contribution. So advocating for greater access to federal loans, which is, there have been a number of proposals at the federal level for an expanded Perkins program, which we're not too excited about because it's actually much worse for students in terms of the benefits than the current Perkins program. But somehow or other, at least making sure that students know that there are certain loans are better than others and steering them towards the right ones.
Mm-hmm. So the Assembly Higher Education meeting is meeting in a half hour about Stafford loans and a resolution because the interest rates are about to go up at the federal level?
Correct.
Is that right?
That's right. For subsidized Stafford loans.
Okay. So the next topic I wanted to get to is Cal Grants, and we've talked a bit about it, and there's a lot of good things to be said there. There's also about a half dozen pending bills in the legislature right now about Cal Grants. So, Debbie, I'll start with you. What's working? What needs to be fixed? How does this program fit into the question about affordability?
Great question. It is a huge, the Cal Grant program, the importance of it cannot be overstated. It is a huge, important piece of the college financing picture for hundreds of thousands of California families. I want to start off by just saying having a little bit of a complaint about the word affordability, and it's a word that I use all the time. It's a word that we at TICAS use all the time, but I think it has really resonated with so many people that it takes off, and it's probably the reason why there's so much of a focus on college affordability these days, because everyone can relate to it. I mean, like probably many of you, I have an iPhone, and because I have an iPhone, it means it must have been affordable for me, right? Because I bought it. Would I like it to be more affordable? Yeah, I would have liked to pay less for my iPhone. And eventually I would like to be more and more affordable so I can, get a new one whenever I need one after I drop it or something like that. There is a difference, a fundamental difference, though, in terms of college affordability, between making it comfortable to afford college and making it possible to go to college. And I think that's where we see the Cal Grant program just playing this instrumental role. Cal Grant program is very well targeted. All of the Cal Grant program dollars, it's about $1.5 billion these days, it goes to meeting students' financial needs. So it's an entirely need-based program. It is really making it possible for students to go to college who might not otherwise, I would say, and I kind of differentiate that from programs that go higher up the income chain, programs, for better or for worse, like the middle class scholarship that has been proposed, that, certainly make it more comfortable for people to afford college. I think it's less likely that it's a make or break situation for those students when it comes to the middle class scholarship recipients. But I think with all the Cal Grant bills that are out there, certainly TICAS and a coalition of student civil rights groups supports a number of them that would make it easier for people to get Cal Grants by extending the entitlement window, making it more possible for students to get larger grants that will support more of the costs that they incur, and really targeting the program even more closely on the lowest income students. So I think that's what we like about the bills that we support. I think there are others, all of which increase investment in the Cal Grant program. All of this investment in college affordability is a good thing. I don't want to make it sound like any of these programs or bills are not, noble efforts. But we have a little bit of money maybe this year, which is nice. It's kind of a reprieve from some of the previous years. But we can't afford to do all of it. And so what's the highest priority? We would say to help make it possible for more people to go to college and complete college.
Thank you. And David, Cal Grants are very big for UC, obviously. I think 40% of the Cal Grant budget goes to UC. Is that right?
I think what we've sort of focused on is about 30% of UC students have their fees completely covered by the Cal Grant program. The way I kind of think about the program and the role that it has played in recent years is with the public disinvestment for higher education, essentially costs that used to be borne by broader society of California taxpayers have really become focused more and more on enrolled California students. The taxpayers and their legislators have not stepped up and kept that sustained investment. And so instead, the costs are falling in the form of higher tuition on students. The Cal Grant program, to its great credit, essentially insulates the lowest income of those students from that impact. And essentially, the state is taking on the burden. It's kind of a focused benefit rather than a general subsidy to all students. We would rather not have had to see the tuition increases to begin with, but given that they're going to occur, that program has been essential in maintaining access to UC. It's really started.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to ask about a couple of the suggestions that Hans made in his report about the prepaid savings plan in Florida, and I guess the report also talks about a state-operated loan program in Massachusetts. So Hans, I wonder if you could describe those programs a little more, and then have a discussion about how those respond to the issues here.
So I think it's just a point of interest that other states do have state-supported loan programs. After talking to experts like Debbie Cochrane about whether California should develop such a program, I think the answer is it's really not necessary right now. There's lower hanging fruit with respect to loans that we should think about. And one, and I'll let Debbie and David talk about this more, but one is making sure that students do avail themselves of the opportunities that do exist for federal loans, and that some of those federal loans are income-based repayment, so that the uncertainty about whether you'll be able to repay is lessened because it's going to be a share of your income. So I think that probably right now is not the right time for California to develop such a program, but if the Stafford loan program falls apart, if they can't get the interest rates down, and we'll find out soon if they're able to do that or not, then it's certainly something we should think about. Investing in students and the return that you'd get on those loans is probably not a bad return given the low default rates we have from our public institutions and the students who go there. In terms of a prepaid college tuition savings program, as I said, you set aside a certain amount of money. By the time your child graduates from high school, you are guaranteed that it will pay tuition. At Florida, they have different levels for whether you're going to try to pay for community college tuition, Florida State, or the University of Florida. The key issue there is the accounting. You have to make sure that the returns that you expect are reasonable so that financially it holds together. And then secondly, you have to make sure that there is an agreement between the state and the higher education systems so that students and the systems are held harmless from that program. What I mean by that is you could have a program where it turns out the guaranteed tuition isn't enough to pay for the cost of providing that tuition. The state has withdrawn support because of budget crises, and then the university is stuck providing lower cost education or providing education to students who haven't paid what is necessary to keep the college solvent. And then the people who are harmed by that are the ones who didn't save. And the savers will tend to be middle and upper income people who aren't able to avail themselves now of some of the loan or grant programs, and who have the resources, most importantly, to engage in a savings program. And so I'm not saying there aren't some red flags here, but there are some examples of programs that are very popular and that do help some of the middle and upper income families. And maybe it's a better way to help middle and upper income families than, say, a middle class scholarship program, perhaps.
So Debbie, you've looked at other states and seen a lot of other programs too. How can you respond to these ideas and any others you might have seen and how they might pertain to California?
Sure. I'll focus in probably on the state loan program issue in particular, because there have been a couple programs that we've looked at somewhat closely. I think the reality is, as Hans mentioned, there is not going to be anything really that can ever replicate the benefits of the federal loan programs. Income-based repayment, but also deferments and forbearances that are available to federal student loan borrowers who find themselves either temporarily or permanently unable to or struggling to make payments on their loans. There's protections for all of those situations for borrowers under the federal student loan program. And so it's just not really feasible for a state loan program to recreate all of that. And in some ways, it creates a lot more complexity for students to have to worry about federal and state loan programs. So, I think there is a clear consensus that federal loans are the best way to go for students who need to borrow. That the aggregate maximums for what students can borrow are generally sufficient to enable students to get bachelor's degrees or even graduate degrees. As the limits are higher, the higher you go. in your education. I would say, our research has shown that more than half of students who are taking out private student loans have not exhausted all of their federal student loan eligibility. So we kind of consider state loans more akin to a private student loan. States often consider their state loans more akin to federal loans, but without those types of protections, I think there's no question, federal loans first, always. I just also flag one other thing in terms of opportunities to take advantage of federal student loans is that a lot of the California community colleges don't offer federal loans to students. There's more than a dozen, I think 16 or 17 at our last count, that have just opted to pull out of the federal student loan program, meaning that students at those colleges cannot get loans whether they want them or need them or whatever. If they want a federal student loan, they are told they need to go to a private student loan. They need to go to their bank, maybe their credit union, maybe Sallie Mae, maybe use their credit cards. All of those are much worse options for students than federal student loans. But that is a decision that's very, very much live here in California. There's more than 200,000 students enrolled in California community colleges where they don't have loan access. Just that thought.
Thank you. And David, could you talk about those options and how they might pertain to California?
Sure. We have contemplated what a prepaid tuition program would look like. It has been suggested from time to time, either by regents or by legislators. There was at least a couple of bills over the past 5 years have come through, none passed, but that encouraged the development of something like that. What we found is, if you look, and you're right, these have been enacted in a number of different states at various points in time. Their success rate is not great, precisely because of the two factors that you mentioned. One is the ability to sort of accurately predict how much the state needs to sort of supplement this fund so that it will in fact cover tuition by the time a family's child enrolls, which could be 10, 15 years in the future. And secondly, the highly volatile level of tuition because of state funding changes over time. So the way it works is you kind of buy a tuition future. I mean, when your kid is younger and maybe at some point in K-12 could be quite young, you buy at sort of a negotiated or a posted rate 1 year's worth of tuition at the state public university. And then you buy that, what you pay then is not necessarily a discount. In other words, usually it's the then current price plus a certain premium. But what you're basically paying for is predictability, because you know what you're paying for now and you can bank on it, and you know that whatever the sticker price of tuition is when your kid finally gets to be, is ready to enroll, you've already paid for so many numbers of years. For that to work, and to take into account the volatility and unknowns, you really have to charge families a premium. It's like any kind of an insurance plan. In any kind of an insurance, you basically pay more for the premium than you're probably likely to get back. And you do that in order to buy, in order to avoid risk. So essentially, for this to be solvent, families would likely have to pay in more than what the actual cost would be, the benefit being that they would at least know what it is far in advance. And I'm not convinced that that issue of predictability is actually more of a barrier than the actual cost for these families. So I don't know that trade-off of potentially requiring families to pay more than sort of the actuarial value of the tuition is the right solution. But
Well, thank you. I have a couple more questions, but I want to open it up to the audience because I know there are a lot of topics out there of interest. We also have a microphone. Marjorie in the back has the microphone. Unfortunately, we only have one, but if you could wait to get the microphone so that the web audience can hear us. Well, why don't we start right here and then here.
Thank you. Lori Najura from the California Student Aid Commission. May I say thank you very much for your public support of the Cal Grant program today. I have actually a three-part question about private student loans, one for each member of the panel. Hans, in the study, it appears that you are using both federal and private loans when you talk about student loan debt. So can you confirm?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Debbie, several times now in different hearings, I've heard a representative from the CBA testify that private student loans have a lower default rate than federal student loans. Can you tell me where the support or the data support for this comes?
There's a few places where there have been some default rates for private student loans or delinquency rates that have come out. They're not really verifiable. It's really unclear whether they're comparable in any way to federal student loans, but I think Equifax has done some work on that. I know we have some information on that, which I'd be happy to send to you. But
Thank you.
But we generally don't tend to rely on it because there's no information about what it even is or how comparable it is to the federal student loan default rates.
Okay. And then David, for you, I know some of the UCs do have institutional loans. Do the campuses calculate delinquency and default rates or repayment rates, and is that information publicly available?
We do have relatively small institutional loan programs, and they're usually targeted at students who, for whatever reason, fall through the cracks and may not be eligible for the standard federal loans, or who have some extraordinary need where, for whatever reason, the federal programs aren't adequate. We have looked, in fact, we manage the collection of those centrally, and we do have the default rates on them, I believe, although I don't think that we actually have them published anywhere. We compare pretty favorably, certainly on federal loans, to other institutions because generally the students who graduate from UC are able to, start a career, progress as expected, and because they graduate with relatively manageable levels of debt, our default rates are in the very low single digits. First for federal loans, I can't speak to our institutional ones on that.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. Right here, there's another question.
Great, thank you.
This is for all of you. Because we're talking about the default rates, this is a real concern to Department of Education, of course, and I'd like to know what is the status of the gainful employment mandate that came about a couple of years ago, and now it was all about return on investment. The community colleges were affected. We had to post things on our website to ensure that students knew how much the program cost, how long it would take them to get it. They had them to labor.
Employment, who wasn't familiar, was in 2011. It was the U.S. Department of Education rule that defined gainful employment. The Higher Education Act had long specified that certain types of programs, meaning almost all programs at for-profit colleges and career education programs and certificates at community colleges or any other type of college that offers them, they are authorized to get federal financial aid because they prepare students for gainful employment in an recognized occupation. So the U.S. Department of Education decided that some of these programs didn't look like they were doing a good enough job preparing students for gainful employment, and so they decided to define what gainful employment meant. That rule was finalized in 2011. The For-Profit College Association called APSCU sued the Department of Education over it. The judge upheld the department's authority to regulate and the need for them to regulate, but found a couple flaws in the regulation. And so as a result, the rule was vacated, and the Department of Education is right now figuring out whether or not they're going to re-regulate on gainful employment. They've solicited comments, and comments are actually due today. So if anyone wants to go home or go back to your office and go to regulations.gov and say, please regulate on gainful employment, or whatever you'd like to say about gainful employment, today's the deadline. Sure.
Thank you. And other questions? Yes, right here.
Good afternoon, Lizette Neverett from the Community College League. I had actually two questions. I had both under policy recommendations, and I wanted to know if there was any thoughts to look at any impact that the ineligible list that the Student Aid Commission created or started in 2010, I believe, for Cal grants, and see what that might do for default rates. And then the other is if anyone had looked at the use or either benefits or effects of the scholarship program here in the state.
So in terms of what we did in our study, we do identify that institutions that have been identified by the Cal Grant program as ineligible, by and large, are mostly private for-profits. And as I noted in our presentation, they have higher default rates, those institutions do. They have higher loan amounts, and they have lower completion rates. I think those kinds of regulations are steps in the right direction. When you have a limited amount of money, you want it to go to places where it's most effective for students. And so I think those kinds of directing the funds are very smart, and they're the right way to go. In terms of scholarships or grants, we do see that the more grants that you provide, and this is not shocking, the more grants that are available, the lower the loan amounts will be for students. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what you meant by scholarships, but I'm taking that to mean.
The scholarship.
Oh, the Scholar Share program. We did not look at the Scholar Share program, sorry. Yeah.
Debbie or David, anything on the Scholar Share program? Or?
No, we actually haven't done, I mean, it's clearly utilized by our families, but we haven't done any, that would be actually an interesting line of inquiry to sort of see if families that take advantage of that are less likely to have students who graduate with debt than others. But I don't have any data or stats to cite for you.
Thank you. Another question right here.
Yeah, I just had one question for anybody on the panel, but I was curious if anybody's looked at, after receiving the degrees here in California, how many students stay in California after receiving those degrees? Is that something that is measured at all?
Has anybody done work on that topic?
We have actually. We've done it in a couple of different ways. We've done kind of informal, well, I wouldn't say they're informal, but they're imperfect alumni surveys. But what we've done more recently that I think is more exciting is to look at data that we've been able to receive from the State Franchise Tax Board, the Employment Development Department, that looks at actual wages earned in California and match those wage earners with UC graduates so that we can sort of see who graduates from UC and goes on to earn wages here. And we find, and the results have been very, very preliminary right now, but we absolutely want to try to use that to make the point that it's a fantastic investment in the economy of California to support public education here. I believe some of the other segments have also sought access to that same kind of data so that they can run their own numbers. But it really gets to, I think, a key point that we want to make about another way to sort of quantify the contribution that these graduates make to the state.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Other questions?
So the other question I have is, what about the implications for policy for how are we supporting our students have an infrastructure in terms of helping them find a job search, career development, all of that? Because the slides that Dr. Johnson showed, there were certain majors, obviously, that are making more money than others. I'm in education. I'm way at the bottom, but I'm still happy. And I have a career development background, so I'm very concerned about people getting in and out, and there aren't enough, whether they're counselors, advisors, coaches, consultants. How are we helping our students find the right fit and knowing what the labor market is all about, and job placement in quotes?
Mm-hmm. David, do you want to talk about what UC does to connect students and jobs? Or?
Sure. So each of our campuses has at least one, and in some cases more than one, career services center that tries to provide that kind of guidance to students. And we are, although we don't sort of coordinate their activities centrally, we have talked about whether or not it would be nice to have a system-wide initiative to expand those services, not just to currently enrolled students looking for jobs, but frankly recent graduates who 1 or 2 or 3 years out of graduation might still be encountering difficulty in securing the right place. I mean, I think that an alumnus would think of that as a great service that they could provide. And especially if we can exploit the network of other UC alumni who have found a spot and who can provide that kind of mentorship or advice or pointers. But that issue, because of the recession, has become, I think, even more of an area of interest and an investment on the part of campuses, because it's not as easy as it used to be to help these students find employment.
I think the other part of this, in the face of big budget cuts, when you think of the community colleges, for example, and we recently did a study on what's happened there with in terms of staff and faculty, if you have to protect a program and that's where you're teaching students versus a service that's clearly important but not in the classroom, what are you going to decide and what are you going to do? And we saw that a lot of community colleges were trying to protect credit instruction. And I understand that decision completely. But when we look at private for-profits, and there's a range of them, so I don't mean to paint them all with a broad brush, but one area where I think they've been very effective at recruiting students is talking about their placement process, and that is very persuasive, and students are looking for that, and they want that. And so to the extent that as we have more resources available to kind of connect students with employers, and there are a lot of innovative programs going on, again, at the community colleges, probably more so than in other places, I think that there's a real demand for that on the part of students.
I would just add, this is another place where I think we really do need better data, and the need and the call for better data may actually lead to more investment in those types of services. The Student Aid Commission is trying to collect data on job placement rates. They're part of the required disclosures for the gainful employment rule. As part of that whole process, the U.S. Department of Education tasked a technical review panel with coming up with a standardized definition of a job placement rate. So we didn't have all these different rates from all the different accreditors and states and whatever. The technical review panel basically threw their hands up and said, we don't know, we can't do it. So when you just see two different placement rates, they're probably not comparable. And I think it's not good for students, and it serves as a marketing advantage for some of the for-profits.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, there's one right here.
Good afternoon, Camille Wise. I'm an educational researcher and consultant, and I want to thank you for your valuable report. And I was waiting for the end to make sure that all this loan I have is worth it, so thank you for that. My question is this. I'd like to know, I agree with your assertion that better data equals better policy, or it informs better policy. I'd like to know, do you have some data you might be able to share on the demographics of your students, who they are, whether or not their parents went to college, any of that type of data? Might I be able to find that or get that from you?
Who wants to start? David, you want to start at UC?
Sure. I mean, we do publish annually statistics about the socioeconomic background of the newly admitted students, both at the freshman and transfer level. And we have a pretty comprehensive report on the income ranges and borrowing levels, grant assistance stuff of our students. I guess, are you interested in data that might be available as a researcher or actual?
Both. I guess what I'm trying to ask, and I'm assuming, and also Dr. Johnson, because you're an expert in demographics, what I'm trying to figure out is, if we're talking about accessibility and affordability, we obviously are talking about a group of folks that have been historically disenfranchised. So in order to inform better policy, I'm wondering if there's some data available, perhaps in this study or elsewhere, that talks about student debt and talks about access for those students that are historically disenfranchised from higher education.
Mm-hmm. We do, thanks for clarifying that. Every year when we do not only look at our applicant pool or admits as well as who actually enrolls, we look at trends in terms of the number from underrepresented minority ethnic backgrounds, from families with first-generation college, families where the first language spoken is not English. And we've been gratified to see positive trends and generally sustained trends in all of those areas. This past year, for example, for the very first time, Chicano Latino students represented the single largest ethnic bloc within our group of applicants to UC. And so it lets us feel that we're at least keeping pace with changes in the demographic trends in California. We also know that, and we report on this with some regularity also, that that financial aid programs are particularly important to families from non-traditional backgrounds. They are much more likely than other students to receive financial aid, not because of their background per se, but because of their income and their other aspects of their resources. To try to help illustrate that any change in policy is likely to affect this group of students and access for this group of students more than others.
Mm-hmm. Debbie, has the Institute done work on demographics and access, or?
We've done some, and the data limitations are enormous in this area. I would say most of the data that we use is our national surveys, and you just start to get down into small sample sizes. When you go too deep, when we have some kind of individual points we've looked at for various testimonies or what have you. The one thing I will say that comes across in all of it, and is always statistically significant, is that low-income students have more debt than higher-income students. And I think that's one of the things that it feels a little counterintuitive. Often we talk about it like low-income students, they get enough grant aid, they're fine. It's the middle-income students, they've got all this debt, and the higher-income students, they can afford it anyway. In fact, students who are getting federal Pell Grants, the lowest income students, have much higher debt loads and are much more likely to borrow than the middle income students or higher income students.
Yeah, and Debbie's right. There's no ideal data set, but we have a lot of workarounds, and we have a lot of information that we have developed on California's post-secondary student population, what ethnic groups they're from, what income distributions they represent. And again, I'd say it's kind of a glass is half full, half empty. We look better than the nation in a lot of ways. And in fact, the New York Times just had a story about elite colleges not being very diverse in terms of the students' economic backgrounds, but singled out 2 elite universities in the nation as having a pretty high share of Pell Grant students from low incomes families, and those were UCLA and Berkeley. So California does better than a lot of the rest of the country, but that doesn't mean we're doing great because the rest of the country is doing so badly. And when we look at some of the stuff that we've been doing on the effective budget cuts on students and underrepresented groups, we see that, again, half full, half empty. Declines in student participation rates have been pretty even across the board, so similar for Latinos than as for whites and Asians, but that's not good that they're going down, for example. So there is some data, and I'd be happy to talk to you about what we've done and what data sources are out there, but it's not exactly what we'd all want.
Other questions? Well, we're at the end of our time, so thank you all for coming in. Please give a round of applause for the panel.